first of all. It's a strange environment having 3/4 of the people online, a quarter in the room. So it's going to be difficult turning backwards and forwards given where the camera is. So I'll try and speak to the camera as much as I can, but the draw of live people in the room is is also pressing. So I'll do what I can. And one of the things that Melissa asked me to talk about was value conflicts. You could say moving beyond value conflicts, as I've put in the title. The other way you could frame this is actually turning what could be an entrenched and destructive conflict into something that's generative, because it's not about avoiding conflict, it's about actually managing conflict in a way that will enable you to generate something new. And so this is what I want to cover. I want to talk about a systems theory about value conflict. It's a theory that I started developing when I was working in New Zealand before, so that was 2003 to 2010. And I started developing this work around 2007. And it's one of those iterative things where the more practice I do feeds into developing the theory, and then the theory informs the practice. It works like that. I'm going to talk about the implications of that theory, which is really fairly simple for managing value conflicts. And I'm going to talk about 3 different ways of using systems approaches. The theory basically shows intervention points that you can use. And I'll give the practical examples from natural resource management here in New Zealand. Now, I feel a little bit like when I read over this talk in the morning, I thought, hey, this is a bit of a frozen time capsule because all of my examples end in 2010. So this may seem rather sort of dated to you. I would actually say that it doesn't matter when a piece of work was done, as long as it's relevant to the present day. It's worth talking about. So actually some of the talks I give examples from maybe 30 years ago. Don't think there's a problem with that. But you may suddenly say, oh, but you don't know what happened after that piece of work. Things went badly downhill since then. So you may have some counter examples to share when I finish talking. And I'm going to end by talking about the connection of the kind of research we do to decision making. Now, anyone who works in a CRI, this won't be news that you actually have to connect to decision making, but it's worth reiterating, I think, in a research context. So I'm going to start with some systems theory of value conflict. And I'm going to do an injustice to the work of Wes Churchman and Werner Ulrich, who were working in systems from the 60s through to the 90s, and summarize their work really in a couple of minutes. And I'm going to use a visual language to explain this model of conflict. I'm going to start by just explaining value and boundary judgments. Now the cursor's not showing up, but never mind. So the oval you see on your screen represents inclusion and exclusion. So inclusion of stakeholders, the people that whose voices you listen to, and also the inclusion of the issues that matter to those people. Any boundary also represents exclusion as well as inclusion. So boundaries simultaneously enable something and they constrain other things. All boundaries have that dual function. So the boundary is basically about what you include or exclude and whose voices you include and exclude. And boundary judgments are linked to value judgments. Value judgments are not general principles. So you're not talking about kindness, equity, fairness, these sorts of things. We're talking about what matters to people in a context of action. That's how I'm defining values. And so we see that values end up driving the boundaries that we set in our projects. So what matters to people, what matters to us as researchers, and what matters to stakeholders ends up informing what we think of as relevant or irrelevant. But we don't come into the world as kind of autonomous, rational beings that can just make any boundary judgment. Boundary judgments get built into our institutions. So it actually becomes possible to see how certain values are easier to express than others in institutions. And if you've worked in institutions with really firm boundaries about what's discussable or not, you can sometimes actually find yourself pushed out of an organization if you say something that offends those boundaries. So there's this tight relationship between values and boundary judgments. In practice, I tend to talk more about values than boundaries because people often interpret boundaries as a constraint and don't necessarily, they tend to see the constraints more than the enablers. So sometimes talking about values can actually open up different possibilities for exploring boundaries. It's worth also saying something fundamental about what a systems approach assumes. So systems approaches basically start with the assumption that everything in the world is either directly or indirectly connected with everything else. But we can't have a God's eye view of that interconnectedness. So every perspective we take is partial. And it's partial in two senses. It's incomplete, so there's a boundary judgment involved. And it's partial in the sense that it's value full rather than value neutral. So it's informed by values. That word partial in English has those two meanings, and both of them are relevant. So if we're starting with that kind of diagram, we can see what happens as you begin to have competing frames. So what you have is two of these boundary models overlapping. So there may be an area of common concern that is framed differently according to the different boundary judgments and different values that people are pursuing. So a clear example of that, which I've come across in a lot of environmental projects, is that the water in a river may be framed completely differently depending on the perspective people are taking. So farmers may see the river as a resource for irrigation, and conservationists may be seeing that as a habitat for native species. So both would acknowledge that there's water there, but the meaning that they're attributing to it is really quite different depending on what they're including in their boundaries and what the values are that they're pursuing. So essentially, it's the elements of common concern that get framed differently that is the core of this this theory. And it goes further as conflict begins to entrench. You get stereotyping of people on the other side and loss of trust in the ability to communicate. So, for example, farmers might begin to stereotype environmentalists as tree huggers, and the environmentalists might start stereotyping the farmers as greedy business exploiters. And these are the kinds of myths of the other side, if you like, that end up entrenching conflict. So stereotyping of stakeholders and their framings by those on the other side. So there are certain implications that come from this for managing value conflicts. The first one is really quite important because everybody has a partial understanding. That means there's potential there for development and change. We don't make the assumption that values are necessarily set. Sometimes you see in some economic analyses, people start with the idea that you actually have to simply find out what people's values are, and you start from that premise. We start from the premise that you can explore things and people can learn. So what systems thinking helps do is facilitate the development of values and understandings and stakeholder relationships, which is about opening up new directions for decision making. So it's about turning that unproductive conflict into something that's more productive. And it's usually workshop based. I've done some conflict resolution work where people wouldn't come into workshops together at the start, but you can work with people separately and then bring them together. And so people are given the opportunities to express their viewpoints, listen to others. And I've said at the bottom that early intervention is often easier than intervention once a conflict is entrenched. While that's true, it's still possible, even decades into a conflict, to create change. And I have got several examples from New Zealand of intervention when conflicts have been a generation long and it's been possible to create a shift. One other thing to say about the kinds of methods that I use is that they're not actually labeled as conflict resolution methods. They're labeled to do with systemic dialogue, systemic learning, but it's usually conflicts that become the focus. So people can actually move beyond value conflicts without ever acknowledging necessarily that they're involved in that conflict, although people often do acknowledge that. So what does the theory tell us? It tells us that there are essentially three types of approach, three intervention points, if you like, in this diagram. One is to challenge the stereotypes, and I've got some examples here of challenging stereotypes and improving mutual understanding. The second intervention point is making connections across boundaries. So because everything's directly or indirectly connected with everything else, you can often find what those connections are. And so people can begin to see how their concerns actually interact with concerns of other people. And then there's actually focusing on the value judgments that people are making and transcending very narrowly focused values. So those are the three kind of intervention points. And very often projects will do two or three of those. It's not a case that it's one or the other, but the examples I'm going to give are very clearly focused on particular examples, particular parts of this diagram. So I'm going to start at the top with improving mutual understanding. And the first project I'm going to talk about is based in the wider Rapa. And it was a project that was asked for by a group of farmers who were thinking of putting in a dam in order to expand irrigation in the wider Rapa. The consequences of doing this would be that everybody would have to change their land use. So most of the land use at that time was dry land farming, and the investment would be so significant that most people would end up having to convert to dairy if they were going to do this, and so that they knew that they were heading for a potential conflict with people that may not want to change their land use. And so they actually wanted to engage ahead of actually meeting that conflict to see what the implications might be and have that dialogue. So we ended up holding a workshop with land users and other stakeholders, and we used an approach called Q-sort, which I'll talk you through. It starts with bringing multiple value statements into a workshop. So in this case, it was multiple value statements about water. And some of them came from interviews with people. Some of them came from the news media. Some of them came from papers. But it's as many value statements as we could find about water. And we asked people in the room to order them on a continuum from agree to disagree. So they're doing this as individuals. We put a normal distribution curve on a table. So the idea was that you only have a few that you violently disagree with or violently agree with, and a large majority of them will be in the middle. And the idea is that people can actually look at each other's arrangements and talk about the differences. So here's two people in that workshop who were actually discussing the differences in their perspectives. There's two ways of using this method. You can either leave it there, so it's purely qualitative, and the outcomes emerge through the discussions, which is what we did in this particular workshop. We didn't go for any further analysis. And the upshot of this was an agreement on further work, but engaging with all of the people in that locality. So I don't know if some of you may know what happened in the wider Napa after this, but at that particular time there was quite a lot of openness to discussing this, and part of the reason was that the leaders of this initiative actually set up this dialogue ahead of time. And what you can do is do some quantitative analysis. So you can use something called cluster analysis, which doesn't, it's unlike factor analysis that clusters factors together. It clusters people together. And one of the things you see when you actually cluster people, so this group of people have a very similar profile in their values, is that it cuts across stakeholder boundaries. It's rarely the case that you find that one set of values corresponds exactly with one set of stakeholders. And because you see that diversity of viewpoints within stakeholder groups, and also a coalition of similar values across stakeholder groups, that it breaks those stereotypes. So you can do that quantitative analysis and feed back to people. And I have done that on several occasions. I've done that on drugs policy making in Australia and on attitudes to interdisciplinarity here in New Zealand as well. So another example, this example comes from the work of Karen Cronin, who used to work here in Manaki Whenua. I actually got involved working with Karen right at the end of this piece of work that I'm going to talk about here. So I helped her write it up for publication, and then we did another project, which was all about applying this to industry, and I'll just say a little bit about that. So this was in the context of the genetic modification debate, which was much more conflictual in New Zealand than in most places in the world. The method works a little bit like that last one that I talked with you about. So again, interview diverse stakeholders to determine the values that matter. I think Karen interviewed something like 90 different people, and to abstract out those value statements. And in this case, she's getting individuals to order the issues from what's core to them to what's peripheral. So the things in the middle are the things that matter most. The things that are peripheral are things that either don't matter that much, or they could trade for something else that was more important to them. And again, it's another way to represent visually the people's value judgments. People discuss their orderings. So in this particular workshop, they had representatives from science organizations, from campaign groups, and anti-GM campaign groups. I think there was somebody from Monsanto, and there were various other people. So people really at the cutting edge on both sides of that dialogue. Now, it broke stereotypes because everybody was so surprised to see environmental issues as the core concern for every single group. It was right in the middle. At that time, the big issue was horizontal gene transfer, and whether using genetically modified crops, for example, genes could transfer via bacteria elsewhere. And so that was of central concern to the campaign groups, but it was also of central concern to the scientists. And that destroyed the stereotypes and actually enabled dialogue in a way that ended up with some quite subtle understandings emerging. And I'll say a little bit about the second project that we did together, which was applying this in industry. So we were working with food production companies and with a couple of CRIs in saying, before you put all of this millions of dollars investment into a technology, can you have the dialogue up front to actually make some reasonable judgments about whether this is worthwhile, or whether you can actually deal with the potential harms that people can see? And one of the things that emerged through that work was that people are actually quite willing to accept genetic technologies if the benefit is for humanity, if it's things like a health application, whereas they're not willing to accept it on the whole if it's just the benefit is for private profit. So people can actually make quite discriminatory judgments, and that emerges out of this process. They may come in taking a clear pro and anti stance, and may come out with much more subtle understandings. So I'm going to move on. Again, you can do this quantitatively as well. You can do a quantitative analysis and feed this back to people. Going to go on to the second area, which is making connections across boundaries. I know there are some people in Manaki Whenua here who do causal loop modelling. This is an example of causal loop modelling. So this comes from a piece of work that our team in ESR did, and it was funded by the Sustainable Farming Fund. It was about the transmission of Campylobacter from animals to humans, and the question was, why is it that New Zealand has such a high rate of Campylobacter food poisoning? Now, the piece of work was stimulated because some of the scientists in ESR had done a piece of research that essentially blamed dairy cattle for pooing in the water. The water then becomes a vector to transmit food poisoning bacteria to human beings. And this was front page news, the dairy industry being such a significant part of the exports of New Zealand. I think it's, at the time we were working, it was 52% of exports. So it was front page news. The farmers were refusing to talk with the scientists, saying that this was outrageous, that this is not the case, that they're at fault. Scientists were saying, well, the media has stereotyped what they were saying. This is not quite what they were saying, and there was it came to a point where there was a real concern that the farmers might not want to cooperate with the science anymore, in which case that was a real threat to the organisation. And we were brought in to help broker some dialogue, not to solve the problem, but to help broker some dialogue to at least find a way through. And the way we approached it is through causal loop modelling. So this model you can see up there, don't look at the detail, it's the form of it that matters. We started working with the group separately because really they didn't want to talk to each other initially. So we took them into separate rooms, and we're working on representing the causality in models like this. So there's an area at the top which is all about the human sewage system, and that's really what the farmers were mostly focusing on. There's an area on the bottom left which is mostly to do with dairy cattle. That's a lot of where the scientists were focusing on, but there were also scientists interested in other things like wild ducks, and there are various other bits and pieces that are in there. So once they'd actually produced their models and we pinned them on the wall, we brought them all together and we kind of pulled the rug out from under them, because I think what they were thinking that they were going to do was justify their view of the situation to everybody else involved. And we didn't ask them to do that. We asked them to walk around the room, look at everybody else's models, and see if there's any elements in those models that connected with elements in their own models. Which is why across a morning we could build up this whole diagram, and it dawned on people that their boundaries were all too narrow, that you've got a much larger system with Campylobacter flowing through it, and it just didn't make sense to focus on one part of the system in the absence of the others. So this is a good example of how widening the boundaries changing the boundaries of analysis actually changes what it's possible to say. And as I say, the disagreement was not resolved in that room, but talking reasonably happened in that room. And so you can get that kind of shift relatively quickly using this kind of model. There are ways of using these kinds of modeling approaches quantitatively as well, but it takes a lot longer. So you're talking, a year or two's research project minimum. And in a conflict situation like this, that's not going to fly. So you really have to do it qualitatively to get the shift. Another example, this is from the Canterbury Strategic Water Management, the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, which I was involved in a very small way back in the early 2000s. So it is interesting because I've done several follow-ups on this piece of work to evaluate the impacts of it. And going back to Canterbury 5 years after we have done this piece of work and discovering that nobody in Environment Canterbury actually knew about it anymore, and yet they were still enacting the outcomes of it. It was really quite interesting. The researcher doesn't need to actually have the memory, for stakeholders to remember this. It's the impacts that matter. So here we go. So this started with Brian Jenkins, who was the chief executive at the time, asking for a full range of consultation on values around water. So they went out into every local community in Canterbury and asked people about their uses of water and their values around water. And they came out with 40,000 value statements about water. And the point at which Brian Jenkins approached me, he was saying, what do I do with 40,000 value statements about water? The complexity is overwhelming. And the first thing I said is, well, are there any clear themes that these fall into? Because a lot of that complexity comes because people are focusing on their own local water body. Once you abstract it out a little, you can actually see that there are some clear areas of you can make value statements. So there's water quantity for irrigation, there's water quality, there's issues around climate change. There's Maori understandings of water, and we ended up abstracting out into 10 areas, 10 key areas to consider, which became decision areas in this kind of diagramming. So we used an approach called strategic choice, and we used the leadership team that Brian Jenkins had assembled. So it was 20 leaders who had very clear values and opinions on water management, but were open-minded enough to still discuss it with others. And we did several days of workshops with them. We'd brought over a guy called John Friend, who was a consultant in the UK who developed this approach. And so John Friend and Jeff Foote, who at that time worked for ESR, facilitated this workshop. And I was kind of in the background. I'd help them develop the approach. So there are certain decision areas which might be to do with water quantity, water quality, etc. Biodiversity was one of those decision areas. What you're looking for is the possible policies that could be developed for each decision area. So you begin to develop a diagram like this, and then you look for the incompatibilities between these policy areas. So, for example, unless you can find water from elsewhere, you're never going to be able to increase water for irrigation and improve water quality at the same time. Those two things are an incompatibility. As it happens, one of the key outcomes of the Canterbury Water Strategy was taking water from the Alps. So they did actually find water from elsewhere. Also using water saving technologies for irrigation to quite massively reduce the amount of water take, so that you could begin to have some of the longer term environmental values being pursued at the same time. So what you're doing there is looking for options for each decision area that will work with others, and you can quite quickly see what the feasible options would be. So there was a kind of economic expansion and forget everything else option that was on the table. There was a moratorium on further irrigation and pursue the environmental values above all else. And there was another one which I'd hesitate to call the middle ground, because this is not about a balance between environment and economy. It was about actually finding those innovative solutions like new technology for irrigation, like taking water from the Alps, and that essentially moved through and became the one that everybody wanted to focus on. So I was in public meetings before this workshop where people were really very angry and shouting at each other, and there was really no meaningful dialogue. And afterwards, as this was taken out for consultation, there were still disagreements, but people were talking reasonably, and it was very clear that that innovative approach was the one that people needed to focus on. It also involved completely reshaping governance, which I know that people in this organisation have been involved in projects around that. Yeah, it was an interesting thing also to go back after 5 years and discovering everybody I talked with in Environment Canterbury didn't even know these workshops taken place, but they were really quite pivotal in changing people's perspectives. It's also worth noting that what happened when the government intervened, when there was this emerging consensus around the alternative that was going to be selected, that the government stepped in and they did actually abolish Environment Canterbury's democratic governance and put in a quango. And that quango took only 2 weeks to talk to the stakeholders and reach the conclusion that that was the only really reasonable approach to take. So this kind of approach produces robust solutions that can survive that kind of intervention, which is really worth noting. So on to the third area, transcending narrowly focused values. I'm only going to give you one example of this because time is pressing. This example was from Tasman. The first project that I led in New Zealand was around water management, and one of the case studies we worked with was in Tasman, so that initially the research that was done on water there had shown that there was a 22% over allocation of water. Some later research was saying that was as much as 60% over allocated. And the Tasman District Council and some of the landowners wanted to put in a water storage dam to deal with the fact that drought was affecting that area. And there was conflict over that. A lot of people didn't want their local rivers dammed. And we used an approach here that was really focused on the value systems. We ran 2 quite large-scale workshops, and by large scale, I'm talking about 60 or so people in each one of them. So the first one was with the landowners. The second one was with local community. We actually leafleted everybody in the local communities around the 3 rivers to get people in, and about 60 people came in. One of the requirements here, which the council put on us, was that it has to be doable in the same time that a public meeting would take. Public meeting might take 2.5 hours. And what normally happens in a public meeting is that the council will present its preferred options and maybe one other, and then everybody will stamp their feet and saying, I don't want that. And that's not a productive way of really running a meeting. So we're looking for an alternative to how to run a meeting that will be much more engaging with people's values. And this is the steps that we ended up setting up. Start with presenting key facts about water systems. We did that really pithily in about 10 minutes because some members of the community wouldn't even know the existence of aquifers, for example, and that water bodies are joined up underground. So there had to be some key facts. We explored meanings of drought to different stakeholders. That took about half an hour or so, because what emerged from that is that drought mattered to everyone. Kayakers, anglers, they all had problems with drought. I think if that hadn't been the case, this method might not have worked, but we'd done some previous scoping and realized that there was a consensus that drought was a problem that mattered to resolving this. And then we actually identified the values that mattered. And so that was a brainstorming exercise where nobody was actually going to say, but that doesn't matter. Everything goes on the wall. And then we set up a chart with all the various options that people can think of along the top and all the values down the side, and people writing in small groups what they're saying about each of those options in terms of those values. So what you're doing is placing people in a position where they're not only having to evaluate options in terms of their own values, but also having to evaluate it in terms of other people's values. And it's just surprising how something as simple as doing that can make people think again about the breadth of values that they're taking into account. So there was an example on the small group that I facilitated where there was a woman who came in who was saying absolutely she does not want to see any dam on the three rivers, on the two rivers rather, that we were looking at. And after she'd heard some what the scientists said about the over allocation, and she said, okay, so if we're going to deal with drought, we do have to have some kind of solution, but and it does mean a dam, but we don't want to get into the same problem in 10 years' time. So in 10 years' time, we don't want to be in a situation where we've brought a whole lot more land into productive use, and then the water's over allocated again, and we're back into a sustainability problem. So one of the things that emerged out of that workshop was the idea of, yes, we are going to have a dam, but we're also going to have a sustainability policy that will make sure that we don't get back into this situation. So there'll be some control over the release of land for productive use. Just in terms of the practicalities of this, we had 5 facilitators. It was really disciplined in terms of time, and we did manage to get through this in 2.5 hours. We did an evaluation of the method, and some of the things that the evaluation came up with was that it created constructive engagement. So people experienced it as little conflict. I would have said there was conflict, but it was a constructive kind of conflict. There was definitely appreciation of a wider range of values came out of that. Some people moved away from early assumptions, although I would say that nobody had a road to Damascus conversion in such a short period of time. But there was certainly a moving away from some earlier assumptions, and those synergistic policy options emerged from it. One of the key things I think that was the confidence in there being a fair process that mattered to people, and that actually was broader than just the work that we did. That extended to the fact that the council was already fairly community engaged, and that was one of the kind of factors I think that predisposed this to working. The fact that people are willing to come into that discussion in the first place because they actually trusted that the council would be open to listening. So good quality governance was a critical success factor, if you like, in that sense. So what I've talked about here now is the 3 intervention points. I've talked about challenging stereotypes of stakeholders. I've talked about widening the boundaries, actually showing connections between different people's boundaries of concern, and also beginning to transcend narrowly focused values. And I just wanted to really end by looking at the connection of this kind of work with decision making. So there are 2 ways that you can connect this kind of work with decision making. You can undertake this kind of participative engagement and then simply report to decision makers. That's the usual thing that social scientists do. And it has limited utility, I think. If you don't actually involve the decision makers themselves, they have limited learning. It's much easier for them to distance themselves and say, well, you haven't taken account of my context. Directly engaging the decision makers in the process itself is far more powerful in terms of actually generating that learning. Now, that's a lofty ideal in some ways. I've had to work in situations where policymakers have, where the politicians rather have refused to actually engage, and you have to kind of make compromises and set up ways of having dialogue with them along the way. But ideally, if you can get them into the room, that is the best possible way forward. So I'll close at that point and open up to questions and comments and further dialogue. I'm sure you've seen where these things have progressed, and you might be laughing at my naivety of where I left it in 2010. We'll see.
You might be keen to know that EKN's starting back at the start on that work around values right now. So
Are they? Okay.
it'll be interesting.
Oh.
Yeah, there's a bit of a bit of a deconstruction of the CWMS.
Right.
Ongoing.
Ah.
So yeah, any questions?
Yeah, I'm interested, Gerald. Thank you for that. What do you see as the role of a CRI in that sort of process? You know, because we could do the research to help the processes, or we could train people up to do it, or we see it more as like we could be the facilitators in the room, and even more that brings some of the science as well. I'm just interested in where you see a role of an organisation such as ours.
Yes. Well, we were facilitators in the room for sure.
Yeah.
So there's a social systems group in ESR where I was working, and that was what we were doing. And the research element was on the methods as opposed to the science behind it.
Yeah.
But we engaged with the scientists as well. I mean, the human dimensions of sustainability work that we were doing around Tasman and several other locations had biophysical scientists and social scientists involved. The social scientists were looking at these kinds of methods for intervention, and the scientists were bringing their science into some of those workshops.
So we've got a couple of questions online. Daniel, I'll get you to ask your question because it was a time-stamped question and I don't know what Joe was talking about at 11:38. So Daniel, can you unmute and ask your questions about evaluative practices?
Yeah, asking for a friend. How, I guess my question was about resolving or opening dialogue to inform effective interventions. But how does this relate to evaluative practices such as outcomes mapping and outcomes harvesting, etc.? I just wondered if you could share some thoughts on that, perhaps.
Yeah. So so I started. So just let me say something about the trajectory of my work over the years, because I started out as a psychologist and really had to react against a lot of the things I learned in psychology and had to rethink it all. And I ended up setting up my own business for 4 years as an evaluator. So I was doing evaluation work, and it's the evaluation work that took me into systems thinking. And one of the things that I've always had difficulty with is I don't see much boundary between the evaluation and the systems work. So a lot of that work can be reprofiled or repackaged, if you like, as systems thinking or evaluation or operational research. You know, a lot of these things are looking at similar things. Yeah, I don't know if that kind of answers your question. I would say that it's important to do evaluation systemically, though. That a lot of evaluation, especially in the States, I don't know how it is in New Zealand, but certainly in the States, one of the frustrations that evaluators have is that government sets the variables that they can look at, and then they just have to collect data basically and monitoring. Whereas you actually need to be systemic in thinking about what it is you're looking at in the first place, what measures that you're using for evaluation. It means understanding the interactions. It means understanding the boundary judgments people are using, the perspectives that people are using. It's understanding the emergent properties so that you're not just measuring parts, but you're actually measuring the things that come that emerge out of the interactions of those parts. I mean, I think those are the kind of key principles that I would bring into evaluation. And I think some of the evaluation approaches are quite usable in these kinds of systems workshops as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Maxim, you had quite an interesting question around disinformation and how to manage that in the processes. So do you want to unmute yourself and ask that question? This is a way to find out if someone's gone out for a cup of tea. So I'll read it. So Maxim asked, he said, in the case of GM, there's a lot of disinformation. So how you manage to deal with that as a, you know, that there's a, I guess, an assumption that the information that's being presented is, that people have is kind of valid, so or reliable.
So I've got two answers to this. One, I've just got to be careful of not being interpreted as being naive around science. So the example I gave of the feasibility study around developing a new dam in Tasman, that was a case where people were really concerned that there wouldn't be enough knowledge of the water systems for people to make reasonable judgments. And so that's why we had the scientist up front actually just presenting some key facts. And I said, I've got to be careful not to be interpreted as naive, because there are boundaries to how science gets constructed. So science is not entirely free of those kinds of issues around misinformation. Melissa was talking to me just before this talk about a particular literature review which had large amounts of studies about dairy in it, and the researcher had concluded that dairy was the most important thing. Well, that's where the funding is, that that dairy became the majority of the research that was done in this particular thing. So you've really got to think about the boundaries of the science too. So that's one answer. The other answer, I'm going to anonymize, because some of you may actually know the people I'm going to talk about. But when we did the causal loop work around brokering around that conflict, which had kind of been generated by the media between the farmers and the scientists, I had some preliminary scoping interviews with people to find out what we were getting into. And I talked with a union leader who said to me quite categorically, that they would be willing to deny the science, to lie in a workshop, to in the interests of their own members, and they've got no compunctions about this. And this is a fairly prominent person, or they were at that particular time, and we knew we were going to have to handle that in a workshop situation. So what we did is we broadened the boundaries of who we involved out in that union, and we brought in 4 or 5 quite senior people in that organisation who were also landowners and who wouldn't have agreed with that kind of perspective, because they were doing work with scientists, and we simply outnumbered. It's as simple as that. We had to do that. I mean, when you're thinking about there's this tight connection between the perspectives and the people that have those perspectives, and so you have to be able to be critical of those kinds of issues of misinformation and
But how would
represent
you-
accordingly.
How would you have managed that? So that's somebody that has been incredibly candid and self-aware, that's saying
Yeah.
that I'm prepared to lie in a workshop.
Yeah.
So lots of people wouldn't be that, they might do it, but they
Yes.
wouldn't be candid about it.
Yeah.
So you had some information that you were able then to respond to. How do you do that if they're quite prepared to lie, but they
Yeah.
don't tell you about it?
Yeah.
So
So your best protection is diversity.
Assume it's going to
if you
happen.
assume
Yeah.
that it's going to happen.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
If anybody cares about it, there'll be vested interests playing that game. Absolutely.
yeah. It is interesting though that I mean, my experience is for the majority of people, if they feel the process is fair, they're going to be less likely to do that. So your two protectors are diversity of perspectives, so that there's people who can kind of call that out if it happens, and a fair process that is perceived as fair. That person, I would say, fair process didn't matter to them, but that's not the case for the majority of people.
But it does place at risk, almost central to almost all of your methods was about values.
Yes.
That kind of collecting that value information.
Yeah.
And that's then the kind of
Yeah.
the building blocks.
That's right. So there's two dimensions to that diversity. There's the diversity of value statements that you're collecting in the first place. So you don't necessarily start with what's the people that you're bringing into the room. Not always, you can, but in several of those methods, we went out to the media, the literature, and to collect that much wider set of value statements. So you're already broadening the information that people are using beyond what they might have immediately to their own fingertips. But the other dimension of the diversity is the people you have in the room in the first place. People are going to be more honest when they know that they might be called out.
How do you deal with people who are absolutely unlikely to have any representation at the table you've created? Like, any tips or tricks on that?
So so this is one of the main things that my work's known for. It's an approach called boundary critique. So I didn't really discuss it in this, but it's going to be more in the presentation I give tomorrow, where that's a central concern, that you always have to explore different possible boundary judgments, and both in terms of who's included and what issues are included. So that's your essential responsibility as a facilitator, to open up your own perspective to critique by others as well. Now, the really interesting thing has been, so the early work back in the 60s and 70s was quite naive. It simply said, open up the boundaries. You can't open them up infinitely, otherwise you'll be involving everybody in the world, given that things interconnect. The issue is, how do you actually justify boundaries, given that you can never be 100% inclusive? And that's the kind of responsibility to really be explicit in your own thinking and dialogue with others. What values are going into those decisions about who's included and not.
Are we going dedicated on the social practice theory, systems thinking interface? I know we were sort of planning on it, but I'm not sure if it's got.
Yep.
Oh, has it got a different label? Okay. Then I might save my question. That right here.
Okay.
Quite specific.
Lisa, there's also a question.
Oh, so
Oh, hi. Great presentation, thank you. In an earlier example from the Wairarapa irrigation work, you mentioned that a number of value statements were proposed or brought to a workshop or discussion. How were they generated, and do you have any pointers on how does one go about generating those type of statements?
Interviewing to start with. So I can't remember how many interviews that were done. There were a group of researchers, Anne Winstanley, Maria Heppy, and a few others were interviewing people initially. So there's boundary critique involved in that. You have to think about who you're actually reaching, whose voices might be silenced. A technique that I use sometimes is to ask people who would have a different view to you when you are interviewing somebody, rather than ask them who else would you recommend, because that they'll recommend more people like themselves, but who would have a different perspective to you. And it's surprising how quickly you can actually cover different perspectives that way. So we did some interviewing. We actually went to the media because there'd been a lot of media kind of hype about building dams and that kind of thing. And we went through some research papers as well to pull out statements. So those were the three sources.
So, Cara, have you you had an interesting question about links with Tom Crompton's work. Are you?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Gerald.
Hi.
I was I was interested to know the extent to which you've read or familiar with the Common Cause framework around shared values and their approach. And yeah, we're just really looking to see what comments you've got if you're familiar with that at all. It's I believe that framework might have been applied in at least some of the national science challenges. Yeah, so I thought if you are aware of it, it might actually be quite helpful for some of those connecting points to be made clear.
Yeah, no, I actually, I'll be honest, I haven't read it. I mean, I've heard those words, but I've not read it, so I'll be upfront about that. Sorry. Can you tell me what you're seeing, or the connections you're seeing?
For me, it was interesting to discover with someone with a background in conservation, and that was the context from which the particular literature and the framework came from. I found that was very interesting, and I'm now working in the evaluation sphere where values is quite central to how you're framing things. I found that quite useful, but like you were saying before, there's a lot of overlap into systems thinking. Yeah, so it was really just me seeing if you had any more deeper insightful comments to make than I have managed to glean from my own mishmash of backgrounds.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Cara. Jenna, so you're still online. You got a really interesting question about communication.
Yeah, Hi everyone, and thanks Gerald for that very enlightening presentation. I was thinking more on the lines of, especially given the example of GEGM or any other conflicting issue that happens. Largely, the issue is around communication, and how do we use the systems thinking approach? In fact, what are the key factors that we need to keep in mind when we design a communication strategy through the systems thinking path, if you can tell us on those things.
It's a shame that Karen Cronin is not here because that's her background. She came out of risk communication into systems thinking. So she would probably give you a better answer than I would. So I'd recommend you talk to her at some point. So Karen often talks about different stages that risk communication has gone through, that it started out with a very kind of scientific view, and so it was kind of like pushing the science, and everything was quantifiable in terms of risks and things. And then that was challenged because it didn't take account of the value judgments of different stakeholders and communities. So almost the reverse started to happen, that you began to, the communication was taking the community perspective. And what was missing from that Karen pointed out is that scientists have values as well, and also not community people are not without grounded views on facts. So it's not the case that these things are necessarily so separate, and that you actually have to acknowledge the values that flow into the scientific agendas in order to be a little bit critical of that. So that the communication, what I would be looking at in terms of communication is understanding the perspectives and that you're engaging with in the first place. I would be saying that communication isn't about pushing a message, it's about developing an understanding together. So that I mean, of course, when you're talking about government communicating with large numbers of the public, that's a slightly different situation. But if you can actually develop the message out of some kind of dialogue process, then it's more useful in terms of taking account of where people are and to represent some of the diversity of understandings. I don't know if that helps. Have I touched on anything that's meaningful there, or do you want more?
Yeah, it's more of, you're saying a participatory approach would be more helpful if the message is to go right.
But again, it comes down to who gets to participate as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Murray, you've got a couple of quite interesting questions around both kind of technology, but also working within institutions. Are you able to mute? Perfect.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
Yep. Sure, Gerald. Now I remember where I had met you before. I've been involved in the cannery water management strategy way back in the day too.
Yeah.
And I'll be at the workshop tomorrow, so we can chat then. But I just wonder, since then, technology's become available, like video conferencing and that sort of thing. But that would seem intuitively to run against some of what you're trying to do by having these processes in person. But have you been involved in any projects that use these methods in a more remote way?
Yes, I have. Yeah. Sorry. Go.
What were the experiences from that?
Yes, so I have. It's not as easy, that's for sure. So let me give you a particular example. This was an example that was directly framed as conflict resolution. So it's a public health project that I've been doing in the UK, and so this is right at the height of COVID, when we were in a COVID lockdown, and the only way we could do any kind of conflict resolution was online. So the situation was that this public health project had broadened its boundaries to the point where it was coming into a lot of stakeholder conflict, and it was supposed to be focused on improving physical activity in a local community, and it was funded by Sport England, so it's a national level pilot study. And the person who was managing that project was saying, well, physical activity connects to mental activity, it connects to social activity, so we really must have much broader boundaries than this, and basically anything that's done in the locality that gets people active in any way is included in the remit of the project. And a lot of other council services and stakeholder groups were saying that's just stepping on our territory, and they got into a lot of conflict. And this had been taken eventually to the senior managers of the organisation, and they stepped in and said, this is not acceptable. You broadened this but much beyond where you should have done, and they brought the funder in, and so it was a real threat to the funding of the project. And so they asked me to do this conflict resolution online, and I involved the funders, the manager and her team, the senior management of the organisation, and I also got in all of the kind of workers on this who were doing the kind of community development work on the ground, all together in this workshop. And we used an approach called evaporating cloud, which God knows why it's called evaporating cloud. It has no relevance at all to what you actually do. But what you're actually trying to do in this is actually identify what the long-term common outcomes are that all of the participants are aiming towards, and then you're looking then at what the strategy is that each are using and the things that are flowing into that strategy, and you actually can through that really begin to understand the assumptions that different people are making. And what emerged out of that was a strategy that said it is about physical activity, but you've still got to take a systemic view, which means that there has to be a line of sight back to physical activity. It can't be anything, but neither can it just be narrowly physical activity. But the experience of doing that was that 2 hours of conflict resolution was exhausting for people. I'll never forget, because I evaluate all the approaches I do, and I talk to people afterwards, and they said it seemed interminable having to go through this, and yet only a week before I'd done a workshop with some of the same people, which had been 4 hours long, so double online, and they were really energized at the end of it. Because this was they were in a situation where they were actually informing Sport England's policy making, and it was a very positive experience of, they could actually, they were talking about dealing with marginalisation in physical activity and how you can deal with that in Sport England policy. And so it was really enlivening, whereas dealing directly with conflict was hard. It was hard online. So.
Yeah.
So it's doable, but you've got to realise the limitation.
Yeah, thank you. The second question's really about how we can bring this system thinking into organisations, which by nature have to be structured rather vertically. And again, whether you've had experiences at doing that and whether the same methods apply pretty much.
Yeah, so this is interesting. It comes back. So I just want to say something that comes back to how Melissa introduced things at the beginning, because she was saying there's an upswing of interest. So I've been doing a fair bit of work with the national government civil service in the UK. A year ago, there were 300 civil servants in central government who self-identified as systems thinkers, and so they were part of a community of practice. Now it's 600, so it's doubled in a year. So there's a lot of there's a lot of interest in the kind of question that you're asking. My experience in the UK government, at any rate, is that they haven't yet got to grips with the fact that things are done in silos and that there's a huge hierarchy. So there are approaches that help with that. Things like the viable system model, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the other couple of workshops I'm doing here. So the viable system model is not a hierarchical model, but it still represents things in a way that differentiates between different organizational functions. So there's the direct, like service delivery or manufacturing or whatever it is at the front coalface. There's the coordination you have to have across the delivery units. There's the day-to-day management and the kind of the measures that you have to put in place. There's the foresight and strategy, and there's the kind of maintenance of the identity of the organization. So it differentiates between functions rather than hierarchical levels. That's close enough for people to get. So they will recognize that strategy is usually done by senior managers, for example. So there's enough commonality of language for people to move. Now, if you've got somebody who is really wedded to hierarchical thinking and really wants a command and control structure, that will be a challenge to them, because it really does say that you need to have autonomy within constraints at the local level. And it's sometimes for some people very hard to think about autonomy at all. And by autonomy within constraints, I mean that the constraints are set by the higher level, so that each service delivery unit is part of the whole, but they're given local autonomy because those people can see much better than anybody else the direct things that they're dealing with in their environments. So you can use things like the viable system model to help shift an organization away from some of the things that get in the way of doing systems thinking. And so there's an example locally to where I live. I did a project during COVID, which was about evaluating the COVID strategy of a local health trust, hospital trust. And we used the viable system model as part of that. And at the same time, one of my colleagues was also doing a project in really rethinking the organisation of a women's and children's hospital, which was part of this hospital trust. And so that whole hospital is now being managed on viable system model lines. And the chief executive of that hospital has become a huge advocate, basically, of this, and that helps the organisation really see itself more systemically, and therefore it becomes easier, I think, to use other systems approaches once people are beginning to do that. Now, having said that, I'm going to throw in one caveat, that if you're in a situation where you need to design things more from scratch, that actually starting with something like the viable system model, which kind of takes for granted that those organizations should exist in the first place, is not necessarily the best thing to do. If you're wanting to do something that is really quite a radical redesign, sometimes it's better actually to have the viable system model last when you're designing the organizations to implement something new.
Thank you.
That's really
See you tomorrow.
interesting. Thanks, Murray. Graydon's got a really interesting question. Graydon, are you there?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I was just kind of, I suppose it builds a little bit on Maxim's question. I was just thinking about the increasing polarization we're seeing across the world, threats of violence and all that kind of stuff. So I was just, wondering if you've had any recent experiences, examples where there's no common ground between values.
it's hard to say yes to that, actually. Of course, there are particular issues that where there really is little meeting point, and I'm thinking of how I went to a conference in the USA, and there were armed guards outside this medical clinic, and I stopped them, and I stopped and said, "What's going on here?" And they said, "This is to do with you know, this is an abortion clinic, and you know, this is so polarized in the States that they actually have to put armed guards outside." So there are obviously situations where there just is no meeting point. But there are, so one of the things that I noticed that systems workshops do is that they are really clear about fair process and fair opportunities for discussion. They also take people out of the context of everyday action. And the reason I mention those two things is because they relate to a theory of violence that comes from a guy called Randy Collins in the United States. So Randy Collins asked quite an innovative question. He didn't ask, why have we got so much violence? He asked, why have we got so little violence given what we could have? And he actually went into prisons, and he was working with people who had been convicted for violent offences, and he was using the monitoring of continual video monitoring to see what was happening in people's conflicts. He said that, so he was following up really seriously violent offenders, and in 96% of all of their conflictual interactions, they were only verbal, and only 4% went into violence. And he looked at the factors that fell into violence, that caused the violence. He said there were only two. One is a peer expectation that that it was going to become violent. So the peers didn't have to be in the room. The person only had to believe that their peers would expect that violence. And the other one was a sudden collapse in the balance of power. So they suddenly saw a vulnerability on the other in the other person and exploited it. Now, if you transpose that into the systems workshop context, and you can understand that what we effectively do with a fair process is prevent that collapse of the balance of power. And yeah. Yeah, I just suddenly lost the thread. What did I say the other one was?
So the other one was the peer expectation.
The peer expectation. So yeah, so what we effectively do is take people out of their everyday environments where they're subject to those peer expectations. You give them methods to practice that are hard. Something like soft systems methodology gives you a language that is not intuitive, and people actually have to get to grips with it. What that means is that they very quickly have to establish new peer expectations in the room in order to cooperate too. So there's that kind of element of using systems methods that I think nobody mostly thinks about in the systems community, but actually counteracts those tendencies towards complete polarization and violence. And sorry for that sudden pause there, that's jet lag. Yeah.
Thanks, Gerald.
Thanks, Gwen. So we're just we've got more questions than we've got time for. So I'm going to ask Stuart's question, which I think is we could use as a bit of a summing up question. So Stuart, Graham, are you still online?
Yes, I'm still here.
Stuart, do you want to ask your question? I think it's a really great one.
Yeah, basically I wanted to just read it word for word really. Do you have any tips on taking your work from, you mentioned creating those productive dialogues between groups to actually getting it to create change, and be it behavior, policy, practice, or whatever. So I guess, yeah, creating impact with your work. Any tips or tricks?
Yeah. Well, you build it in from the start is the most obvious thing. So you're involving those people who are actually going to make the decisions in any way you can, either directly involved, or if you can't do it directly involved, certainly engaging with them right from the start. Too many researchers, certainly in academia, I wouldn't say this for CRIs so much, but certainly in academia, a lot of people do the research and then expect to get impact afterwards. But it's very hard work to do that once a report has started gathering dust on a shelf, or papers in a journal that decision makers will never read. So engagement is the key thing. The other thing is to think about how what you're doing dovetails with the organisational processes that are going to deliver something. So the Canterbury water management strategy example is a good one for that, because really Econ had a whole bunch of things that they were doing beforehand in terms of both the science and the community engagements, and then they had a whole bunch of things that they were going to do afterwards around community consultation over the options that emerged. So that's one of the best cases I think I've seen of how they had already conceived it before they'd even talked with us. That they had built in that progress towards decision making. So the more your work becomes part of the processes that organisations are going through, as opposed to something separate that is defined as research separately from the actual what the organisations are doing, the easier it is to get that kind of impact. At the same time, that doesn't stop you taking people out of their everyday environments and running workshops and things that have got some kind of special characteristics in terms of facilitating systemic thinking. So does that answer your question?
Thanks, really helpful.
Yeah. Okay.
So unprecedented, we're going to finish on time. We've got a couple of questions that remain unanswered, but I'll pass them on to you and get them to folks. Thanks everybody. Put a little bit of music to finish. Just, yeah, if we can give Gerald a bit of a round of applause. Yeah, and I hope to see, let's stick around just now, see some folks again tomorrow for our session.
Okay. Well, let me just thank everybody who's given up their time to come in. Thanks very much.
Sue?
Is that a